Let's start with something I think we've all noticed by now. People are not dining out like they used to. And it's not because they suddenly discovered the joy of cooking or became health conscious. I don't even think it's because the food got worse. I think it's because the math just stopped making sense. Look, for years, dining out was positioned as something casual, harmless, or just a reward after a long day. But now it just feels expensive. I'm not talking luxury expensive, but just unnecessary expensive. There was a time when, grabbing dinner out felt like a $20 decision. Now it quietly feels like it's $70, $80, or sometimes $110 after tip, taxes, drinks, and just whatever inflation decided to add that week. And most people didn't consciously decide to stop dining out. They just felt like something was off. Like, you open the app or a menu, you scroll, you pick something reasonable, nothing extravagant, and then total updates. It's not even that shocking. It's not even that much more than you actually expected it to be. But you decide to pause, you think about what else that number represents, and quietly, almost without deciding, you just close the app. And I don't think this is just about food. I think it's also about pressure. Given the current state of things, we are in a period where people feel financially exposed. Rent is higher, insurance is higher, groceries are higher, interest rates are not your friend. They were never your friend. And layoffs are just no longer rare. And this illusion of just financial breathing room has started to really thin out. When pressure increases, optional expenses get evaluated. Dining out is optional. For a lot of ambitious people, the kind who care about investing, career progression, and not being financially fragile, spending habits starts to, become strategic. And restaurants sit in this very uncomfortable category. Like, true, they are enjoyable, they are social, and they're very convenient, but they are also one of the fastest ways to leak cash without noticing. I've heard a lot of people explain what's happening with restaurants the same way. Everything is too expensive now. Inflation destroyed restaurants, and you just have to, cut back. And none of those things are wrong. Prices did rise, fees definitely got stacked on, and tipping expectations 100% shifted. Those things are real. But here's what those explanations don't account for. Not every meal feels equally not worth it. Sometimes you leave a restaurant feeling completely fine about what you spent. Other times you spent less and you feel like you just got cheated. The food was the same quality, the price was similar, but the feeling was just different. So this gap between cost and feeling is where I believe the real explanation lives. And I think three things changed, and they all happened so fast that most people didn't notice until the shift was already done. First, prices rose, but unevenly. It wasn't a clean 20% across everything. Menu prices moved at one speed, delivery fees, at another, and tipping prompts showed up at counters that we've never seen them before. So that unevenness matters because predictable costs are manageable, but unpredictable costs, they create something a lot worse, and that's decision fatigue. Every transaction becomes a small calculation, and small calculations add up. Second, the experience premium no longer exists. Look, for a long time, dining out had a built-in justification. You were paying for something, far beyond food. I'm talking atmosphere, ease, and just the pleasure of just someone else handling everything. A lot of meals now cost like, a premium experience, but feel functionally neutral. The food arrives, you eat, you leave, nothing about it was worth remembering, but it costs like it was. So when the price to experience ratio no longer makes sense, the math stops feeling worth it. Third, you became more financially self-aware. At some point, you started doing something that your younger self didn't do, which is translating costs into trade-offs. Not consciously, but just instinctively. You see a $60 dinner and some part of your brain immediately compares that to what else that $60 can do. It could be a utility bill, a few months of subscription, a small step towards something that you're actually saving for. Here is the simplest way I found to think about all of this. Every dollar you spend on food is doing one of two jobs. It's buying fuel or it's buying an experience. Fuel meals exist to keep your life running. They're about nourishment, energy, convenience, and predictability. Cooking a meal on a Tuesday night is a fuel meal. Experience meals, on the other hand, exist to mark something. I'm talking a celebration, a long overdue catch up with someone that you genuinely care about, a date, a birthday, or a meal that just becomes a story. Those are worth paying for, not because the food is, objectively better, but because the context makes it better. Now, the frustration most people feel, it comes from mixing these two categories. A random Tuesday meal tries to be fuel, but it costs like an experience. And nothing about that math feels right. So once you separate them clearly in your mind, you're no longer asking, is this worth it? You're instead asking a much more specific question, which is, what job is this meal doing right now? And once you know the job, you know whether spending makes sense. But look, even with this framework, this still feels a lot harder than it logically should be. And there's a reason for that. Dining out used to be identity neutral. It didn't, mean anything about you. It was just something that you did. Now, it triggers something, internal, some internal questions that didn't used to exist before. Like, am I being responsible? Am I depriving myself? Or what does this even say about me that I'm even hesitating over this? That internal debate, the one that, runs on loop even when the decision should be relatively simple, creates friction, and friction kills enjoyment. You can't be present for a meal, you're still mentally negotiating while you're eating it. The goal isn't to stop feeling that friction. It's instead to move through it faster. So it stops living in every individual decision and starts living somewhere where you can actually manage it. And this is what this next section is actually about. Look, now that the fuel versus experience framework is relatively, kind of clear, here's how to actually use it. This is what's worked for me as a set of simple filters that make decisions just much faster. First, name the job before you order. Before you open the app or sit down at the table, ask yourself one question. Is this a fuel meal or an experience meal? That's it. You don't need a budget, you don't need a spreadsheet, just name the job. Fuel meals should be efficient and predictable. And experience meals are actually worth spending on and worth being fully present for. The mistake isn't eating out. The mistake is expecting fuel meals to feel like experiences or paying experience prices for fuel level value. So name the job, the rest is going to be relatively simple. Second, cut the forgettable meals first. If you're going to spend less on dining out, and you might be, this is where to start. So look back at the last month. How many of those meals do you actually remember? Not just know happened, but I'm talking actually remember the conversation, the feeling, the specific thing that made it even worth going to begin with. So the meals you can't recall are fuel meals that you're paying experience prices for. Those are the ones to cut out and or even just replace. So protect the meals that create memory, but let the forgettable ones go. Third, let home be good enough, not a competition. A lot of people make home cooking a lot harder than it needs to be by setting just the wrong goal. They try to replicate restaurant quality, optimize nutrition perfectly, or just try to make something overly impressive. That turns food into a second performance, and you already have enough performances in your life. And home meals don't need to compete. They need to remove pressure. So simple food made without stress, eaten without guilt. That is not a downgrade. That's just a, for lack of better words, a structural support for your finances, for your health, your attention, and also your evenings. So look, dining out isn't the real subject of this video, if you haven't noticed by now. What we've actually been, talking about is the transition from automatic spending to intentional spending. And the transition, wherever it happens, whether it's food, clothing, subscriptions, or anything else in your life, always feels a little strange at first. Look, automatic habits feel easy. They're invisible. You don't think about them, which means you also don't stress about them either. Intentional habits, on the other hand, feel harder and just much more deliberate. Like, they require something from you each and every time. But here's what happens when the intention becomes habit. Money stops feeling like a constant negotiation with yourself. You're no longer asking, is this okay? You're instead asking, does this fit the role that I wanted to play? And that is a much easier place to make decisions from. So here's the thing to remember. Dining out did not die. Unconscious dining did. And that is not a loss. It's the difference between spending money on habit and spending money on meaning. And once you know the difference, once it lives in your bones and not just in your head, the guilt disappears, the second guessing starts to slow down, and the meals that you do go out for, you actually end up enjoying them. Thanks for watching.